And we're looking forward now to the Second Acts program, which Rick Moody is moderating. Rick, look forward to it.
Thank you very much. I'm going to begin with kind of a heretical statement by quoting a Princeton man, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who famously said, "There are no second acts in American life." Well, just as we fight against them in football, we're going to fight against that statement here today. Yes, there are second acts in American lives, and that's what we're here to talk about. And I'm going to give you one more quote, and I'm going to turn it over to our panel, and that's from Muriel Rukeyser, the great poet, who said, "The world is not made out of atoms. The world is made out of stories." The world is made out of stories. So that's what we're going to hear today. We're going to hear 3 remarkable stories. And our procedure is each one of our panelists are going to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. They're going to tell their story of how they have begun their own encore career. We'll define that later on. Reinvented themselves. These are issues that all of us are concerned about, okay? When we've had a chance to hear those 3 stories, we're going to drill a little bit deeper. And we're going to have the panelists talk among themselves, and I'll ask a few questions here and there for another 20 minutes. And then the last 20 minutes, we're going to open it up to our town meeting here. And everybody's going to get a chance to ask their questions. And if we run out of time, we'll find a way to continue it tomorrow. Okay? That's our protocol. Let's begin with our first speaker, and we've picked Dave Richards to be first because he did this 5 years ago when we did another version of Second Acts at the 40th reunion. And he's going to tell us his story. And I want to just give you, every one of our panel, I'm going to give you a little question like we do for the politicians yesterday. Of course, they never answer the questions. Those are the politicians. And these guys might not either. That's okay. But I know a bit about Dave Richards' story, and it's a remarkable story of struggle against rejection, age discrimination, fighting back in a world in which he was able to contribute something remarkable. Go to the Beinecke Library. Anyway, tell us your story.
Thank you, Rick. Can you hear me? Jan and Bob will tell you how they were drawn to their personal respective second acts. I was, as some of you know, nudged to mine by a psychiatrist treating me for depression. The major crash before the crash of 2008 was brought on by the financial services industry. Well, as you may remember, that of 1989, which was blamed on the real estate industry, of which I am a part. And I then chaired a real estate department of 3 partners and 6 associates at the New York branch office, which I co-founded in 1982 of the Chicago-centered law firm Sidley Austin. 18 months later, after that crash, I had 1 partner and 1 associate. And since the practice group's business was mostly from my clients, I thought I had summoned in the wave, and then it was my fault that the wave went back out. That personal gloom tripped over into clinical depression, and I was hospitalized for 3 weeks at a mental health hospital here in Connecticut, where most people were in for drug and alcohol problems. There weren't a lot of white, upper middle-aged guys who'd been fired. I went back to the office on the Monday after the Saturday I was discharged from the hospital. And every morning, for my customary work arrival hour of 7:30 a.m. until the secretaries came in at 9:30 a.m., I lay on my office floor to make the time pass because I didn't have the work to fill the day. So my shrink asked, to beat back depression's enemy, what I used to like to do. And I mentioned book collecting because I'd done that here. I won the Southport Book Collecting Prize. And he said, why not do that again? And I mentally shrugged and allowed politely is how I might. I started with the World War I poets, and then I shifted to Kipling in '92. And I began a computer catalog in my acquisitions, noting the references in the earlier Kipling bibliographies applicable to what I was collecting. And at the time, I had no plans to build what became the world's largest collection of Kipling first editions, or to give it to the Beinecke, or to write 2 books out of it. Nevertheless, the solitary processes of collecting and then writing it up in that catalog helped heal me. Nobody was making me do it. Nobody criticized how I was doing it. Nobody even cared whether I did it or needed it done, and I could abandon it at any time without consequence or criticism. And in my still kind of fragile and wounded state, all those characteristics were important. And then Yale comes into the picture. I was foolish enough to have 2 Yale reunions every 5 years, which is an expensive proposition. So in 1997, as part of my law school reunion, I mounted a small show in exactly the same vitrine, actually in the Beinecke, as the show that's up there today, and I was able to share with some of you yesterday. And a PhD from Yale, a guy named Thomas Pinney, professor of English at Pomona, who had written the 6 volumes of selected letters of Kipling, not the complete letters, but selected, had already written the volume which included the letters to Thacker Spink, which are up in the show with, for those of you that saw it, the receipt for departmental ditties, which I pointed out yesterday morning, and he came back to see them. And the Beinecke people showed him the catalog that I had given them. And I got it back 6 weeks later with all the typos corrected, from this man I didn't know, and a note saying that Oxford wanted him to do a bibliography. And he didn't have time because he was doing the letters, and I should do it. Well, at this point, I was embarrassed into a corner. I had to do something to get turned down so I could tell this man I had been turned down. And I sent it to Oxford and the catalog, and they wrote back and said, we're not in the bibliography business, but you ought to write to X. And I wrote to X, which is something called the Oak Knoll Press, which is the biggest publisher of books on books in the United States, and they sent me back a contract. And I said, wait. I said, I'm still working full time. What do you expect? And they said, we're not going to give you any money.
Well, that's a relief.
Come back to us in 3 years and tell us how you're doing. So I was all very worried about what I call the J.P. Morgan biography problem. You work in a valley for 10 years, and the guy in the next valley is also working on J.P. Morgan, and you both get interviewed on the front page of the New York Times and get the shit kicked out of you because you didn't do what the other guy did. And I didn't want that to happen to me, so I figured if I signed the contract, at least if anybody else tried to do this, they'd tell them they had this guy in New York who was already trying. And actually, that did happen, and they waved off whoever that was. So I estimated it would take 5 years. It took 10. It took 3 million keystroke processes, according to my Word program, 800 pages, 2 more years to proof and illustrate. I invented a new organizational model for the book. It has more features than other Kipling bibliographies. And I taught myself the skills needed to do it. They say that the VCR, Americans taught themselves to use the VCR so they could watch pornography. In my case, I had to teach myself computing in order to type in Greek letters and other things that you need for a bibliography collation, but I did it. Now, back to what was being talked about before. In 1989, when my personal legal business collapsed, I thought I might be demoted or discharged, but such action was never threatened. In 1999, that did happen, and with 30 other partners, I was de-equitized and given a job at 18 months, contracts at 90% of my salary to work just as hard for the same clients. Since this was part of a sad story in my profession that led to the demise in the last 2 months of Dewey Ballantine, which was to squeeze older partners out, this was a big story. And this was the headline, actually the cover of the American Lawyer back in 1992. And that cover is supposed, of course, to be an eye chart. It's supposed to make it clear that you're fading. Can I have the next slide, please? Next. This was how my picture appeared in the same motif. Right. The iconography got a little better over time as I learned how to manipulate the media. And meanwhile, a lawsuit was started, a discrimination suit by the EEOC in Chicago. Not by me, but I agreed to become the lead witness to speak to the EEOC under oath. And it became a bit of a problem for the law firm because I was representing the Tribune in New York, and Sidley was representing the Tribune in Chicago. So every time they ran an article, they had to say that both the plaintiff and the defendant were their lawyers. But this is the EEOC slide. Next, please. This is the article in the Tribune. Next, please. Now we're getting into the power poses. This was one of the later articles from the National Law Journal. Next, please. It made, of course, the Wall Street Journal. Next, please. And pretty soon I'm smiling, but the articles are still going forward, and I was the only one who was ever identified among the 30. I was the only one who held up my hand and said, yes, I got fired. And so I became the poster child for the EEOC. But being famous for being fired is not, in the end, all that much fun.
Takeaway message.
Yes. And then the law firm changed its story. We weren't fired as we were originally told in order to make room for the younger partners. We were fired because we'd done bad things. Eventually, the case settled. I spoke to this audience 5 years ago before the settlement, and the settlement was for $27 million. It was half of what we were owed, but it was better than a sharp stick in the eye. The depositions were kind of ugly, and I was the target, deposed for 6 hours and 50 minutes. There's a 7-hour federal limit. And I was asked, among other things, why I'd been seen on the floor several mornings laying on my office floor with my eyes shut. So it wasn't pretty, but all during this lawsuit, I had my collecting and my bibliography experience be working through. I gave my collection and have for the last 5 years, but from 1997 to our last reunion, and the catalog came out of that and the bibliography. Collateral second acts have multiplied. I'm a member and officer of the Grolier Club in New York, which is this country's oldest club for rare book collecting. I speak around the country on Kipling and rare book collecting. I'm on the visiting committee at the Morgan Library. I'm a board member of the Bibliographical Society of America, and I'm the vice chair of the Beinecke Library Associates. In other words, my second act or night job was a sort of a parallel to the day job of a law practice, which I still have, but taking me into a whole new area of friends and out of the lawyer-centered experience that I have. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. That's the catalog of my show, which some of you saw yesterday or 5 years ago. Next slide. This is me and Kim Cattrall.
We're not going to ask more about that.
She played Mrs. Kipling in a movie, and I was brought on as the expert, and Kim and I had a chance to chat. Next slide. This was the settlement of the suit. Next slide. And the government established the principle, and this applies to a lot of you out there, that there should not be an age limit in partnerships, whether they are accounting, law firm, medical, or what have you. This gives all these professions a headache. They need to move people through, but we're all living much too long for that model to work anymore, and some of us, this is what we're up here to tell you, can't think of anything else to do, and so it's something that the legal profession is struggling with. Let me just say one final thing, two final things. When I suffered my depression in the 90s, I thought, and I still know, it was a terrible thing. But it ultimately led me to this new and joyous phase, the second act of my life. And so when other bad things happened in my life, as they have, and they will again, and in yours, I always think of Zhou Enlai's answer to Henry Kissinger when the Secretary of State asked him during Nixon's opening to China what he thought of the French Revolution. And Zhou replied, "It's too early to tell." But I want to read you one other thing, which that's a good joke, but this was better, and I found it later. These are the words of William James, and he was consoling a daughter on the suicide of his friend, her father. "But anything and everything is possible for every mother's child in us. We are all in the same box, and not only death, but all forms of decay knock at our gate and summon us to go out into their wilderness. And yet, every ideal we dream of is realized in the same life of which these things are a part, and we must house it and suffer it and take whatever it brings for the sake of the ends that are certainly being fulfilled by its means behind the screen. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks so much, Dave. It's a great story. It's a great story with lots of lessons for us. And I love the fact that you ended with William James, who, although he was a Harvard man, I admit, he was a physician. And our next speaker is also a physician, but who has listened to the dark side of the Force, or some side of the Force. And I want to thank you, first of all, for what you contributed, the wine and so forth, to our reunion here.
Most welcome, Rick.
But I also want to hear, let's give him a hand. Yeah, I mean,
We're not done. More tonight.
he's setting a precedent here. But I also want you to talk a bit about your experience of moving from being a physician to a wine merchant, a vineyard owner, and so forth, which to me is also like being a farmer with tremendous risks. And that's an issue that we all face as we're reinventing it. Can we take the risk? What's it all about? How'd you do it?
Well, it's ironic that you should frame it in those terms, Rick, because when I chose years ago to become a physician, one of the factors in my choice was I want a career where I'm going to avoid risk. I'm going to have patients coming in every day. It's going to be a good, steady income. I'm not going to get rich, but it's going to be fine. But, you know, underlying that risk avoidance was a real passion for great food. And when I left Yale, I went to Stanford, and I was enchanted by the wine scene there, by how beautiful the vineyards were and how much good wine could add to good food and how delicious it was in and of itself. So I started to learn about it then, and I left Stanford and went into the public health service for my 2 years of military duty of sorts. Was part of a wine club there, learned a lot more about wine, had a wine importer who brought some of the best French wines in the world in at reasonable prices, so I continued to learn. And then I went back to Stanford to learn more about internal medicine. And I was fortunate to have a professor there who was not only very good at teaching me how to save really sick people, but he also taught me how to make great wine. So when
Let's give that guy tenure.
yeah, I owe him a lot. I think I owe him getting off the floor that Dave mentioned and avoiding depression, because for 15 years of medical practice, growing things on my 2 acres in a San Francisco suburb and making wine with my friends and getting wonderful grapes from Napa was really at least as much of a joy in my life, probably more than practicing medicine. And after about 15 years of that, I've decided I like this so much. I love growing things. I love great food. Winemaking is so much fun. Medicine is rewarding in other ways, but it's not the same. That I started looking for properties. And to avoid risks, I started asking people who were more experienced and maybe smarter than I what they thought of some of the properties. Finally, I found 41 acres high above the Napa Valley, very rocky 41 acres, in a part of Napa that hadn't become famous yet. And to avoid that risk, I hired 3 different farmers, some of them very famous, worked for the best wineries in the world, and said, well, what do you think of this? Will the grapes be good? Will the wines that come off of it be really good? And they were unanimous in approving it. So I bought that 41 acres, cleared the rocks, planted it, built a house, moved my family there, and practiced medicine and grew grapes and made a little bit of wine in the basement for a few years. And I thought I'd have the practice, which was my safety net, and this vineyard, which was my great joy for the rest of my life. But we had a problem, and the problem was that the grapes were really, really good, and other wineries in Napa started discovering how good the grapes were, started lining up for grapes. Warren Winiarski, who really put Napa on the map, said that when he came and he tasted the wine from my basement, made from this vineyard in front of my house, it reminded him of how he had founded his vineyard in Stag's Leap, and his vineyard and his wine actually put Napa on the map of world wine. So with approval like that, and really enjoying what I was doing quite a bit, I decided I'd like to do more, and I found 750 acres a few miles from my home vineyard, and it was a big project, and again, I wanted to try to avoid risk. Remember, I'm that risk-avoiding doctor. None of my patients are ever going to die.
Okay.
Yeah. So I didn't want to, I didn't want to, and I don't think I could have developed it all on my own. So as a physician, I had put together a physical therapy center, brought in partners, Everybody made 85 times their small investment. I figured I could do this again with the big vineyard. And so I looked for partners. Part of the reason I was able to get the 750 acres is the more experienced people like Jess Jackson, Warren Winiarski, Bob Miner, all thought it couldn't be done. There were too many rocks. There was no water in this part of Napa, and there was no easement to get there. There was certainly not even a road. It was real wilderness. So to solve those problems, I found a great geologist who said, drill in these 5 places to 300 feet at each place. If you don't find water, just be really grateful you've got a vineyard in your backyard and extend your medical office hours, and that'll pay the bills.
Make some house calls.
There you go. So I started making house calls, but I didn't like that too much. And I didn't really want to give up on this rugged property, so I found a water witch. And she came out and she said, you know, Dr. Krupp, if you drill right here, you're going to find an underground stream. And I was pretty skeptical. I'd studied biochemistry at Yale, and she was only charging me $200. The geologist was $12,000, but sure enough, right?
She was right.
She was right. There. What good was my biology major at Yale, Rick? But anyway, she was right, and the really cool thing about her being right was that stream was very deep. So we went back to the 5 spots that the geologists had picked and drilled them all really deep, and they all had water. So now we have 1 million grapevines. We have the biggest vineyard in Napa, and even more important than its size, I think it's one of the best vineyards in the world, certainly becoming that. We sell grapes to 76 wineries and certain brands that you may have tried beyond my wine, like Paul Meyer, Paul Hobbs, Caymus, Minor, Chapelet. We send each of those 5 wineries more grapes than any other vineyard in the world. Chuck Wagner at Caymus would say that I'm the only grower of grapes that he can trust, and that's kind of a universal opinion. But in addition to those 5, we have 76 other winery clients that keep us out of trouble and minimize the risk.
Yeah.
And back to Rick's question, you know, when I found this big property, not only did I lean on a geologist and a water witch, but I consulted accountants, vineyard accountants, that told me that in Napa, most people who own vineyards are either absentee owners or farmers. They really don't know how to sell their grapes. They said, what you have to really figure out is what's special about your terroir, what's special about your farming, what have you got growing there, and you've got to go out and sell it. Well, this was a relatively new role for me, although on my first 41 acres, they started producing in a grape glut, and I had to make 50 cold calls before I could sell the first damn 9 tons of grapes.
Not easy. That's not easy.
But again, minimizing the risk by getting a lot of help from farmers. The smartest viticulturist I had found worked at Stag's Leap, and he rode through the wilderness with me on a big, huge backhoe, and we dug 100 holes and checked the soil and checked the climate. So I tried to do as much homework as I could. I tried to remember the doctors that I worked with that were successes at vineyards and the others that offered me their vineyards for the mortgage payments, and I knew who I wanted to grow up like. So all along, we were trying to grow some of the best grapes to make some of the best wine in the world to emulate Ridge and Chateau Margaux, but we also didn't want to fail. And like Dave, I had gotten somewhat depressed at being a doctor. You know, you can save your patients so many times, and eventually they get older and die, and I was really ready for a change of pace. So this was a wonderful second act for me. Other challenges, other more famous people avoided this property, as Dale saw last week, because it's god-awful rocky. To make it happen, we've removed over 1 billion pounds of rocks. We've broken a lot of equipment. I've always been over budget on mechanical, but somehow we just keep finding new pieces of equipment to break, and we've even got a dynamite contractor who comes once a week and helps us with the rocks. As far as the easement, you know, I think my success has been based on having good people working with me or for me. I had an attorney who really believed in the project and who didn't charge me much for a year of negotiation with 28 neighbors and 135 legal documents. We also had a realtor who was both smart and talkative, and eventually some of the neighbors would say, Stuart, I've heard enough. I'm going to sign these easements, sign these agreements. You know, we'll just get out of here. So that really has helped. About 10 years after planting these vineyards, I guess I've lost my pictures.
We're going to have the wine later on.
All right, we'll have the wine.
The picture is only the picture. We want the real stuff.
I was hoping you guys could see, and gals could see some of the pictures of the vineyard, because it's hard to do it justice in words. But at any rate, that's a message from Rick that I've talked enough, I guess.
We're going to come back to this.
So about 10 years after beginning to plant vineyards, my brother and I thought it'd be great fun to go back to winemaking and start a wine brand. And I must confess that the vineyards had been so darn successful that I was not as careful in starting the wine brand as the vineyards. I didn't rely on as many consultants. And I learned a lot about making great wine, and I think as you've tasted last night and tonight, our wines will rival some of the best in the world, and they keep getting better each year, and Parker and Spectator give them great scores. But I really didn't spend enough time figuring out how to brand a winery. And so that's a caution to any of you who might be starting second or third careers, that sometimes there's more to a new business than meets the eye. And I guess that pretty much sums it up, Rick.
Where's your screen back?
That sums it up, and here we have the wine back again, so it doesn't altogether disappear. You know, I have to tell you, Jan, you have not avoided risk. You figured out how to manage it, and I think there's a profound lesson there for all of us. I want to move to our third presenter today, and he's taken a different path. Each one of our panelists has taken a different path, and I want to have him talk about his artwork, and I think we're going to be able, this is not his artwork, by the way, this is the vineyard, but that's okay. That's okay. Bob Jones is going to speak about his transformation from being a lawyer to a painter. And the thing to keep in mind here is the comment of the great critic Ananda Coomaraswamy, who said, "It's not that the artist is a special kind of person, it's that each person is a special kind of artist." So we need to listen very carefully to Bob's experience and understand the real point of this story. And what I want him to talk about is how his love affair with art, moving away from being a lawyer, has changed over the years and where you are now. Take it away, Bob.
Well, thank you. I wonder, maybe when we get done with Jan's images, Melissa, you could start mine, because I have quite a number, and maybe we'll run them while I'm talking.
We're going to run them while you're talking.
Efficient, I think.
It'll be fine.
Well, I think I share with probably everybody in this room the fact that I have a lot of interests, and you all do too, I know. And when you're a kid, I think you have a lot of interests, and you don't realize maybe that they are sometimes incompatible. I was going to be a lawyer, and I was going to be an archaeologist, and never thought that maybe the two didn't work too well together. And if you're lucky, you never learn that the two don't work too well together, I think, and you keep expanding your horizons and keeping your interests and exploring to the extent you can, one consistently with the other, and then maybe after the other. I've had a lot of good experiences that have broadened me. When I was in high school, I spent a year in France at a French lycée. When I was at Yale, I spent a year in France, and that's when I met my wonderful and adorable wife of 44 years, Bonnie, who was on the same program but from a different school. And we've never, well, I've never been happier, and she's the best thing that ever happened to me. And then later in life, we did a third year in France. I was doing a doctoral program in comparative law at the University of Paris, and I had the credits transferred back to a doctoral program in anthropology that I was doing at the University of Pennsylvania, and it was funded by the University of Pennsylvania Law School, since I'd graduated already from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. So I was combining comparative law, anthropology.
But that wasn't enough.
And no, it's never enough. I think if you die in unfinished work, you die happy, because when you've done it all, what's the point, you know? I wrestled when I was in high school. I was a national preparatory school wrestling champion. I didn't know that, but somebody told me years later. The thing that we did at the Lehigh tournament was the national preparatory, I mean, it was a name that I wasn't familiar with, but that's what it's called, I think. And then I wrestled a bit at Yale. The advantage to me of selecting French as a major at Yale was not because I really wanted to have a French major, but because having been a year in France in high school and then a year again at Yale, the distributional credits I got from those experiences were so great that my senior year I had only to take one course in French, and that allowed me to take courses in philosophy that I wouldn't otherwise have taken, an accelerated course in Italian, all sorts of things that just were fun to do. And I think that's the nature of the human mind. You look for fun. As Pascal said, the most worrisome thing is boredom from sitting alone in a room and having nothing to do. So, is that me?
We got your pictures up here.
Okay. Well, you'll see pictures of a number of portraits I've done over the years, and some landscapes, because about half the paintings I've sold are landscapes and half are portraits. So I've been billed as a portrait artist, but in fact I love to do landscapes, and that's part of the variety that I find pleasure in art, doing lots of different portraits and doing lots of different landscapes and traveling to do both. I've got 14 paintings, I guess now, many of them portraits, some of them landscapes in Europe. I've painted the governor of Pennsylvania, Ed Rendell, for the National Constitution Center. I've painted Jack Bogle, the founder of the Vanguard Group, for the National Constitution Center also. I've painted Sir David Hatch, who was the head of BBC Radio, and his portrait, and his wife's, Lady Mary Hatch, resides in England. I've painted a former member of Parliament. I just recently, in the last 2 weeks, I had an unveiling of my portrait of Temple University's first female president, who's about to become president of the University of Arizona. And I've painted an enormous number of very charming children. So I've had great variety in the portraiture I've done, and lots of landscapes of all different kinds. And we've traveled, my wife and I, because Bonnie is not only a lawyer who was the head of the reinsurance law department at Cigna, but an extremely accomplished artist in her own right, and who also has a graduate degree in anthropology. We travel a great deal to Europe and other places to do portraits, to deliver portraits, and to do landscapes. The one thing I think, I think in answer to your question, we're always evolving. I think in the case of painting itself, I guess my painting has probably become looser mercifully over the years, more painterly, looser brushstrokes, more inventive in some ways. But the one thing I think which is important, which has not changed and I think will not change, is the approach I take to doing a portrait, because it's really critical in my view. Historically, of course, portraits were done with endless sittings, and there's the story of John Singer Sargent doing a portrait of a well-known English woman, and he had camped out at her house for weeks and weeks and weeks, and they'd had sitting after sitting after sitting, and one morning she came down to find him ripping up the canvas because he was unhappy with it, which put her in a state of tears, but he assured her that if he was given just one more chance, he'd get it right. And he did. He did a good job on the second try. But there are two problems with the classical approach to portraiture. One is you have endless sittings, which is a drain on people who have active and busy lives, and it's mostly important people who have or at least interesting people who have their portraits done, so they don't have an awful lot of free time. In fact, John Adams said the worst experience of his life was sitting for a portrait. But more important than avoiding endless sittings, what I do is to use modern technology. We have a camera. We take Bonnie usually with me. We'll take 2 cameras at the same time. We may take up to 800 pictures in the course of an hour and a half. And the reason I do that is because when we've done that, we can go through them, we can give recommendations to the subject, but we give all the pictures to the subject, including our own, some of which will be recomposed or painted over to show how I would redo it if we did a portrait from it. But the key element is that the subject gets to pick how he or she wants to be painted for her or his memorialization, for his or her children, for a public venue if it's that. And you don't have the disappointing prospect of having a painter's view of you, which isn't your view of you. So that when Peter Hurd, who was a good artist, did the portrait of LBJ, and LBJ saw it and said it was the ugliest goddamn thing he ever saw in his life, it wasn't because Peter Hurd wasn't a good artist. It was Peter Hurd's view of LBJ and not LBJ's view of LBJ. When I painted Jack Bogle, he had been painted by 2 other portrait artists, one of whom I won't name, but is the best known and certainly most expensive living American portrait artist, who's done Lady Diana, Margaret Thatcher, Pavarotti, you name it, he's done them. and he charges an arm and a leg and probably both arms and both legs. And Jack went down for 13 Saturdays in a row to sit for his portrait with this gentleman. And when he was done, he got the gentleman's view of him, and I saw the portrait, and it's not that it was badly painted, but it was so unflattering. And when I did Jack's portrait, he said, "Bob, this is way better." And I said, "Jack, you're right." Hey, wasn't even close. So, and it wasn't because I'm a better artist. It's just that the process is much sounder, I think, in so many ways. So that's how I do a portrait, and you've seen some of them. I've done, as I say, in addition to the ones I've mentioned, a number of heads of law firms, some beautiful young women, and some beautiful older women, some handsome gents, and it's been a great pleasure. And one of the greatest pleasures of portraiture, I have to say, is not only the process of painting, but meeting the people you paint, because the people you paint are interesting people for the most part. And some of the best friends that Bonnie, and we've had lots of good friends over the years, best friends we have today are people we've met late in life, some of them, late in life on both sides of the Atlantic, baronesses in France and Ireland, and people of all different stripes, but all different backgrounds, but very interesting people. And so it's been a charmed life for us, and I hope I never run out of ideas.
I don't think you're going to run out of ideas at all. I really don't. I'm so intrigued by what you say about portraiture, because your last comments really open up something which I think we all have to think about, which is how we see ourselves, or how we become ourselves, what I like to say, becoming the person we were meant to be, versus how other people see us. And I mentioned to you earlier that I was intrigued that Matisse, you mentioned this earlier, was a lawyer like you. And I didn't know that, but I know that, and I shared this with you before, that Matisse toward the end of his life said, "It's bothered me all my life that I don't paint like everyone else." That didn't stop him from painting his own way, this process of individuation. And what I hear in all our panelists in different ways is the struggle to become the person they were meant to be in some way or other. Anybody pick up on that, comment on it? Because I see it as a theme undercutting all of this, which is really part of this whole idea of second acts, that it's not too late, that Fitzgerald, that Princeton guy, was wrong. There are second acts. But what will they be?
One of the things in portraiture is, if I paint a landscape and you don't like it, it's fine. You don't have to buy it. But if I'm going to do your portrait, I think I have a moral obligation. I mean, there's an incredible fiduciary obligation that I feel. Somebody's placed a lot of trust in you, because their image is going to be plastered somewhere, and it better be good. And so I try to have a kind brush. If people say make me 5 pounds lighter and 5 years younger, I try to do that. One woman I painted 3 times. She was dying of cancer. She was an absolutely beautiful woman, dying of cancer. And she said, "I like to have my portrait," so I did her portrait. She had a lot of wrinkles in her face because she had great character, and I tried to minimize the wrinkles, and she said, "Put them back." So I put them back, but that was her call. And I think the answer, at least in portraiture, is to try to put yourself in the shoes of your subject and make them happy.
You've raised something very important here. The Italian actress Anna Magnani had her portrait done, and she said, "Those wrinkles, put them back. I paid for each one." Okay? So, but you also went over very briefly, you mentioned cancer yourself. And I want us to kind of open up this question of mortality and limits. This is our 45th reunion. We hope we'll all be here for the 50th, but not all of us will be. We know that. And I want us to be conscious of that question of, okay, time is limited. What will our second act be? And I open this up to our entire audience here, all the participants. If you have questions you want to pose to our panelists, or if you guys want to talk to each other, we have some microphones out there. Wander around here, right up in front.
Well, I'm curious about something. All of you had first careers, and I don't think I heard a lot of good things about the first career. And I'm wondering, what it was in the first career. Would you call it a false start, or was there some things that you took out of it that you couldn't have done your second career without the experience in your first career?
That's a very interesting question, guys. What do you say about
You
that?
know, I,
Pieces fit together.
I found a lot of the scientific training of my first career really prepared me for the second career. Rather than looking at patients' lab tests, I look at grapevine tests ground up. I'm able to treat disease the same way. I think the first career was a good choice for me, and, but I got tired of it. And it wasn't that I wanted to be a farmer or a zookeeper from age 9, but I've always loved growing things. And when I got kind of sick of medicine and, you know, almost as depressed as Dave was, or maybe as depressed, I was really fortunate to find something else that I've always loved doing and open that door.
Yeah, comment.
I had a marvelous first career, I think. As I said when I was a kid, I was going to be a lawyer and an archaeologist, and the first career was a lawyer. I practiced 25 years for one of the oldest and largest law firms in Philadelphia, and I was the head of the corporate practice and the head of the international practice, and it was fun because I got to use my French and the Italian I'd taken my senior year at Yale, and traveled a lot to do deals, acquisitions, mergers, joint ventures, public offerings of securities. I represented the underwriters for all of the what was then Philadelphia Electric Company, now PECO Energy Company, public offerings, and the underwriters for all of the Bell Atlantic offerings. So it was a great career, and the clients paid their bills. They were nice people. And I think the interests I had and had developed over the years before that made things a lot more fun. When we were in Europe and you could speak the language and you had some background in anthropology that made a particular situation amusing, it was fun. But the clients were great, and it was great. But the fact is, you only live once. 25 years, which I had at the firm, was a round number in my view. And if I were ever going to go on and do something else, I better do it now. So then
Time is pressing. How about you, Dave?
Well, I'll join in the mild rebuttal. I was happy as a lawyer. I wouldn't have been able to do the collecting. Marianne and I may end up eating dog food at some point, but it won't be because of the Kipling. It'll be because it'll be something else stupid that I did financially. No, I enjoyed my legal career. One of the reasons it was slightly surprising I was fired was I had been the most senior real estate lawyer in the American Bar Association at the youngest age of anybody ever done there, but that didn't matter to the powers that be. I think there's another theme, though, that picks up on your former question, which is that all of our second acts, Bob's may be a little bit more of an outlier than Jan's and mine, pick up on something that were of interest that while we were pursuing the first careers, we had them. It was there. I started studying the British Empire as a student after I left here at Cambridge. And so it was a chance to come back to that, cutting through it another way. So I haven't been unhappy as a lawyer at all. I've spent the last 12 years of my life giving away the High Line. If you guys know that park in New York, it's been 15% of all my legal hours for the last 11 years. And it's a wonderful project to have been affiliated with. But I happen to have had a lot more fun spending the 15 years doing the Kipling. So partly echoing Jan and partly echoing Bob, it was a feeling that I could do something else. There's a bit of a 10,000 hour, you know this better than I, what is it? You practice for 10,000 hours, the muscle memory. He's been looking at the grapes for a long time, and I've been looking at the Kiplings for a long time, so it becomes easy, and there are connections, but what it gave us was a second pad, so to speak, when we decided to divert. I'm not going to be doing law for more than another couple of years.
I'm so interested in how you've been weaving together the fabric, because the philosopher Schopenhauer said, in the first half of life, we weave the fabric of our life. In the second half of life, we turn the carpet over and see how all the threads are connected underneath, which we never saw before. So in some way, you're picking up these threads. Comments from the group? Any questions? Anybody want to, for our panel here? Anybody working on an encore career themselves? They want to pose a question? Yeah, come on, Ted.
Yeah, mine
You've
is.
had several encore.
Yeah, I've had several. It's been a long sequence. I think I spoke once before, or maybe many reunions ago, about the fact that when I first graduated Yale, I'd been admitted to the med school, because back in those days, you could be admitted on an academic record and a handshake. And I then decided not to go and deferred it because I wanted to study mathematics. I was a math major, math and philosophy. I did that in pretty short order because, math is the kind of field where you don't really have to do lab stuff to get a degree. And then I worked in mathematics and in computing. And this is relevant for the last piece. So I did work for the military. I worked on the Minuteman control system so that I am a rocket scientist, as we always joke.
So when they say it's not rocket science, we won't say that to you. Okay.
Well, in my later career as an anesthesiologist, I'd be doing a neuro case, and one of my buddies would say, you know, here we have a rocket scientist and a brain surgeon, and we still can't get this case done. Anyway.
Humility there.
So, well, I mean, it's very humbling, clinical medicine, particularly in the OR when you're in a high-risk environment. Anyway, I did that. I went back to medical school 11 years after I'd graduated, after doing the work in data analysis and then for the military. I then became a cardiac anesthesiologist, and in short order, that itself was a specialty. But then I had a real, what they called a midlife crisis in around 2000, 2002. I decided I wanted to become an echocardiographer. So this is narrowing within what I was doing. And that's different from what you guys do, at least as I see it. It was more superficially similar. And then I went to Australia and did some training there, and I remember when I took my exam for the echo boards, I was 15 years older than the next oldest person in that room. And I can tell you that we do just fine.
So this is a
against those
takeaway
people.
message, Ted, that we aren't necessarily too old if we think we're going to keep up with it, and I'm 65, all that kind of stuff.
I even taught for a while at some of the hospitals in Boston, and frankly, I wasn't impressed. I mean, maybe it's because I'm also an engineer, and I know I've been computing since 1966, and I'm not impressed by somebody's ability to go on Facebook or something. But at any rate,
Okay.
So all that, and then as I've been going, I've sort of worked myself out of a job. Not quite like getting fired the way David Richards did, but because of the
recommended exit strategy.
Right.
because of the way things have gone in medicine, the short answer is that because of my training pathway and being an echocardiographer through anesthesiology, even though my training was actually with cardiologists, I am almost unemployable. There are very, very few people in the country left who do what I do because of the misalignment in medical care. There is no reimbursement.
Okay, sir, you're raising a very interesting point, which I thank you for that, which is really, we're kind of privileged people up here on this panel, and maybe in this entire room. How do we cope with the situation in which we can't be paid for what we really want to do? I mean, I'm glad you brought that.
So I came to the conclusion, it's God bless them. There are people who do anesthesia for bunionectomies, but I was not put on this planet to do easy stuff like that.
Okay.
And it's hard enough. So then Epiphany came for number 4, which is to become.
Tomorrow morning at the brunch, those who want to participate in a continuing dialogue, we still got 10 minutes, but tomorrow morning I want you to come and anybody else, and we'll have a table and we'll continue this discussion. We need to drill down further, but I thank you for your contribution. Other comments in the room? Yes?
I think the only comment I would make, we're talking about, in a sense, some things have come out which I take as a lesson. Everybody, including Jan, which surprised me, said that what he did before helped him get into what he's doing now.
Yes, that's it.
So it's not as if someone just totally reinvented something he had never had any interest in or hadn't done. And I think that's sort of fascinating as a start.
It is.
What they didn't get into, Dave did for a while and Jan did in particular, Bob didn't, how long it took them to feel that they were confident about doing this new thing that they were doing, and all of the steps and all the struggles they had to go through, because I'm doing something which isn't quite as interesting as what they're doing, but I'm trying to do it myself, and I see that it is work, and it does cause headaches every once in a while, and you're learning something every day. But what hasn't come out yet, but these guys are evidence of it, is that even if it doesn't put bread on the table right away, this sort of change, I think for all of us, is something which, I won't say it keeps us young, because there's nothing that's going to keep us young, but it certainly retards old age. I believe that it keeps us interested, it keeps us enthusiastic, and mentally we can remain much younger by reinventing ourselves at a time when we finally either become unemployable in our old field because the young guys have techniques that we don't have, or we just get tired of it. And I think that the most important part of all of this is not the money we might make from it, certainly, but it's the fact that it's going to keep us going and keep us more interested in ourselves going forward. So.
Great comment.
Yeah.
We're going to take you and make you a spokesperson for AARP. I got some comments and responses.
So, Adrian, I think that's true. It does really keep us enjoying life, learning new things, excited. As in my slow path to competency in the world of viticulture and winemaking and stuff, what I've always relied on is other people. I've always searched for the best consultants I could find, and if I get an answer from one consultant that doesn't seem to make sense, I'll call somebody else up, and if they're diametrically opposed, I'll call a third person up. And as I've learned more and more, I still use consultants, but I'm not so reliant on them. So as I've grown into competency in what I've loved, I've gotten help from a lot of smart and famous people in my field, and I think that's a way, back to Rick's first point, to keep yourself relatively safe, if farming is ever safe.
It is, yeah.
Well, I might just respond a little bit to part of Adrian's comment. How do you know when you're ready? And when I was practicing law for 25 years, I was painting for fun. And so I'd go home in the evening if I didn't have too much work in the law. I'd take out a brush and start painting. And the last week in my career as a lawyer, I invited the head of the largest and oldest art gallery in Philadelphia over to my office to see my work. And he came over and he said, "Well, Bob," he said, "I'll take this one, this one, this one, and this one." So I kind of had a sense and a little bit of it might work, And I would just add to the point that although I wouldn't say, the art made my life more interesting and therefore hopefully made me a better lawyer, but the law has really helped me in the art business because through 25 years of practice with pretty high-class clients, you meet a lot of nice people, some of whom want their portraits, some of whom are art collectors, and some of whom can introduce you to other people. So once the ball gets rolling, I did a portrait of a fellow who is now the head of our old law firm, who at the time was just a partner of mine, who said, "I need my portrait for the Philadelphia Club," because I was president of the Philadelphia Club. So I painted his portrait, and then you'd get an email from somebody who would say, "I would never believe that anybody could have captured Alfred Putnam in oil on canvas. I commission you to do Joe Schmo." So then I do Joe Schmo. And so the law has helped me in the art business.
And there's another message there, too, which is that as we grow older, we do develop a lot of contacts. We know people and so forth, and that's a real asset, those social connections. It's something I'm doing some work with AARP on later life, 50-plus entrepreneurship, and that's one of the strengths that the older entrepreneur will have. There are weaknesses, but one of the strengths is this network. So as we think about this, and I love what you said about the consultants or whoever, I get by with a little help from my friends, and our classmates are part of that, too. Yeah, comment.
When I see Bob's paintings and David's Kipling's and Jan's great graping, and when you said introduce yourself to the wine, I did and will, your stuff will carry on, and it brings to mind an ancient African proverb which says, "Civilization begins when men plant trees under whose shade they will never sit." And you're the best of both worlds. You've seen some of your shade, but some of your stuff's going to hang on. And that's a hell of a second act, man.
That's a marvelous aphorism, and I have to tell you what it reminds me of is someone I've grown to love and admire, Reb Zalman Schachter. Some of you may know him, wrote a wonderful book, From Aging to Saging. And we were in a restaurant a couple of years back, and he said, this aging business, he's in his 80s now, he said, it's really very simple. He said, the real question is, are you saved? And I thought to myself, well, he's a clergyman, what's this? And he says, no, I don't mean it in a theological sense. I mean it in a computer sense. Are you saved? and he said, have you started doing your legacy work? And I think that in many ways, and I thought of that when the president came here last night, and Ed Bass, if he's in the room, we all have some contribution to make. whether it's money or whether it's the works of art that we do or the preservation of the books. And this is part of the legacy work. And that's exactly what that African proverb is talking about. So this is probably the time in our lives when we want to be thinking about that, and in a positive way, not, I'm glad Randy Alford is telling us about the heart attacks and all the rest of that, but there's something else here. Other comments? We got just a couple more minutes left. Back to the room. Yeah, please.
A quick question to Jan Krupp. All of your reliance on consultants, I think, must have brought up the sense of irony in most of us. Where did the water witch come from?
Where did the water witch come from? Maybe he's drilling a well.
Yeah,
and some help.
yeah, the water witch came from the well driller. After he had drilled 5 dry holes for me, I said, Dave, I really don't want to give up on this beautiful, rugged property. What else can I do? And he said, well, I've been working with this water witch who lately has a good batting average. Why don't you hire her? Yeah. And so that's where she came from. We've acquired a lot more acres since that original 750, and I turned to the same water witch again, and unfortunately she didn't do as well, but I'm sure glad that the well driller recommended her for that first initial well.
That's great. That's terrific. Other comments in the room? We've got a couple, maybe one more question. How about in the back there? We haven't taken somebody in the back. Let's get that. Or somebody.
Somebody on the left?
Yeah. I think you can. Yeah.
2 thoughts. One, I was talking to a classmate earlier who's had a hand in organizing this, and he pointed out we were losing approximately a classmate a month, which is sobering and thought-provoking. And the other thought I had is a couple years ago, after years of saying to my patients, in terms of the preciousness, unpredictability, and fragility of life, you never know when a truck is going to cross the midline. I'd said that for a few decades. It happened to me and my wife. A truck crossed the midline. Fortunately, and the cop at the scene looked at the car and said, if you'd been in a Focus, you'd be dead. That was extremely thought-provoking. I've never forgot it.
That's true.
What it's done is lead me to view every day as a kind of gift. I don't mean in some sort of hokey, pseudo-poetic way, but really, if my wife hadn't turned the car off, we would have been crushed. And that makes the pains, the little pains and disappointments and frustrations, it puts them in a different perspective, because at least we're alive to have them. And that's a great source of enduring gratitude. As despite fearing the eventual tolling of the bell.
Very good. Very good. As the great philosopher Bob Dylan put it, every day above ground is a good day. So thank you very much for that contribution. I think we're at the end of our time. We're going to continue this dialogue tomorrow at the wrap-up meal, and I invite all of you to participate, continue, and I want to thank our panelists. They've done a wonderful job.
Thank you, sir.
No, thank you.
Jan, it's wonderful. And your wines really are, I mean, you know they're superb, but I just thought they were terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. You did a great job.
No,